Before I pull up my PowerPoint, I'm going to say just a couple of words about the Trent House. And hopefully you know where it is. It's across the street it's on Market Street across from the Hughes Justice Building, which is itself a fantastically noticeable landmark in downtown Trenton. So we've been there for the house has been there for 305 years. I'm going to start by talking about the longer history of the site. But I also want to tell you, first of all, what our mission is, which is to share the authentic history of the house, the property, and the people with our communities, connecting the past with today and tomorrow. So we don't just look at who was living in the physical structure at the time that it was occupied by William Trent from 1719 to 1724 when he died. We go back and we go forward. And that's why I have something to share with you today about European immigration, because that is something we are looking at, because we were surrounded by immigrant neighborhoods for a long part of the house's history. But I'm titled this Newcomers to Trenton. And I'm going to start with 1679, which is when the first European immigrant colonists came. But I'm going to focus mostly on the Europeans who came in the 1800s, late 1800s, early 1900s, which is when we had a very massive influx of immigrants from Europe in this country and in Trenton. So, as you, I'm sure, know, the first people at what is now Trenton, which was called at the time the Falls of the Delaware, were the ancestors of the Lenape, or also called the Delaware Native Americans. And we have on our site found thousands of artifacts from as long ago as 6,000 years of these first people. And so we also are working with there are 3 state recognized tribal nations in New Jersey that are recognized by the state. And we work with some of them to try to tell something about their current history and experiences. So we have a land acknowledgement. The land on which we stand, our house and the city of Trenton, is territory of Lenapehoking. Many of the people who were Lenape were forced west and north, and there are federally, recognized tribes in Oklahoma and Wisconsin. And we acknowledge the Lenape as the original people of the property and of our state, and that they have a continuing relationship with us. Also important in our history, and that means the history of the Trent House, but also the history of Trenton and the history of New Jersey and the nation, is colonial enslavement. So the first English colonist here was Mahlon Stacy, who was a Quaker. Now, lots of people think that Quakers never held enslaved people, and that is not the case. Many Quakers, the wealthy, particularly, of course, owned enslaved people. And Mahlon Stacy's will lists that he did own one enslaved man of African descent. Now, William Trent, who built the Trent House in 1719, or had it built, I should say, he was originally from Inverness, Scotland. He died, as I mentioned, in 1724, and on his probate inventory, the list of all his property at the end of when they were trying to figure out how to divvy it all up between his heirs, there were 11 enslaved people listed: 6 men, 1 woman, 2 boys, 1 girl, and 1 male child. We know very little about them, unfortunately, other than the name that's listed on the inventory. As you can see, we know their gender and an age group. Either they're an adult, a sort of a teenager, middle childhood teenager, or a child. And the other thing, of course, we know, because they were listed on this inventory, is the same thing that we know about every other item on the inventory, whether it was a fancy mirror or a scrubbing brush or whatever, is what the price or the market rate for that particular individual was at the time based on the assessment that was done to create the inventory. Now, by the time of the Revolution, Trenton had about 500 residents. We don't have a census from that time, but we know from documentary information there were at least 5 people whose stories we know at least partially who had experienced enslavement among the residents of Trenton at the time of the Revolution. It's also interesting to note that the census, once the federal census started being administered, counted people of African descent, both free and enslaved, from 1810 to 1860, the last census before the Civil War. And you can see that while the number of enslaved people is going down, it's still there in Trenton, which was still a very small town, as late as 1850, and recognizing that not everyone may have reported who was living in their household and what their status was. So that's a little background before we get to the period that we're going to start talking about today. So in 1929, the Historical Society commissioned a history of Trenton. It's a huge volume. And that actually, by the way, is the year that the property that's now the Trent House Museum was given to the city of Trenton to use as a museum. It was a very interesting time in our history as a nation. This was a time, and we'll talk about this a little bit more later, where there had been a massive influx of new immigrants from different parts of Europe in particular. And people were looking back, people who were of the original stock, so to speak, of America, particularly all of the states, who were English, Scottish, Irish, German. Those were the major immigrants that had come and established themselves here early on in our colonial and early national history. That was a point in time where people were concerned about whether we were going to maintain a connection with our founding history and our colonial and founding history. And so there was a lot of emphasis placed on reporting back what had been. And then in this particular case, also talking about who had come recently. So a couple of things that I want to point out is that this chapter in this history, there's a chapter devoted to Trenton citizens of foreign origin. And you notice how it was described. It was non-English or bilingual peoples of recent immigration. It didn't count the foreign origin of people who had been here for multiple generations, who, as I mentioned, were largely either from the British Isles or from the Western Europe. They had been assumed to be assimilated into what was known then as American. And we're going to get back to that issue of how does somebody get to be American once they or their family has immigrated to the United States. So in 1920, you can see that Trenton was actually a fairly large town. We had more total people than it does now. I think we've got about 90,000 now, something like that, 85 to 90,000. But more than half of the population either had been born outside the United States or their parents had been born outside the United States. And remember, the census is counting children. So some of this 32,181 are children of people who themselves were foreign born. So that's a huge percent of the population of people who had recently come to Trenton. And there would begun to be a big shift, even in the 20 years between 1900 and 1920, in where the new immigrants, the foreign-born residents, were coming from. So if you look at the blue bars, and these are percentage of everybody that's foreign-born. So in 1910, about a quarter of people had been born in England. Another quarter of the foreign-born had been born in Germany. 20%, 21% had been born in Ireland. Those bars drop, as you can see by looking at the orange bars. So 20 years later, the predominant groups that were comprising the foreign-born population were groups that had previously been very little represented in Trenton. People from Czechoslovakia, people from Italy, from Poland, from Russia, from Hungary. So there was a big shift, even in the early part of even that 20 years of the early part of the 20th century. So one of the things that's interesting to me is, how did America respond to immigration during that period? So I'm going to go back here, and this pattern of immigration was duplicated in many, many parts of America. And people were coming here in droves to work, very often to work in factories, but also to settle in other states and farms and so on. So what was the response? So the first wave of immigration, which is before we're going to start talking about it, is really in the first half of the 19th century, right after the United States was formed, but before the Civil War. And the second wave of immigration is the wave that we're going to be talking about, from the middle, like after the Civil War into the early 1900s. What were some of the responses? In the first wave, we had riots in Philadelphia. These are just examples, called nativist. In other words, people saying, we are the natives of our country. We are Scotch, whatever. Our parents came here, our grandparents came here, and there was a riot against the new immigrants. There was a rise of something called I don't know why, the Know Nothing Party. It doesn't sound like a very effective political slogan. I have no idea why it was that, but they were very much against immigration, very much pushing that as a political agenda. In the second wave, you see something like the Red Scare. After communism took over Russia, there was a real sense that anybody who was coming from that part of the world was going to bring Bolshevikism and rebellion and riots and whatever. And the KKK reemerged at that time. It had kind of fallen off, but in the immediate aftermath of the Reconstruction period, but then it began to reemerge, and immigrants, Jews, as well as Blacks, were the targets of the KKK. Politically, by 1880s, you had immigration acts that began to restrict immigration. And the first one was really on the Chinese Exclusion Act. And this was really directed at the Chinese immigration to the West Coast. But by 1924, you had quota laws enacted, country by country, going back to the number of people who had come here early on and sort of restricting it to a percentage of that number, which really sort of squeezed immigration from Europe. This, by the way, and also World War II really was also an impetus for the Great Migration, at least the second wave of the Great Migration from the South to the industrial North, because this influx of European immigrants to fill those jobs in the factories was now cut off. And so employers hired people to go down to the South and encourage African Americans to move north. What they got when they were here, was not the glorious free North that maybe they had hoped for. But there was a chance they felt to escape the Jim Crow situation in the South and to gain access to better economic opportunities. So, what I'm interested in is how did we get to these things, these different reactions to immigration? What was the underpinnings of those reactions? So I'll tell you a little bit about that. So we understand now that race is a social construction, that it's really about classifying groups of people on some characteristics that put people in a hierarchy generally. Some quote races are expected to be more intelligent and moral and so on. What's interesting, by the way, is whoever developed the classification system put their own group at the top. So if you were someone from England who was developing this classification system, you put your group, Anglo-Saxon, as the top level. If you were German, you put the Teutonic group, however you define that, as the top level. Even though now we generally think of race in a different way, back then, white people were categorized by race as well. So Teutonic, Alpine, Mediterranean, and so on. And as early as the 1700s, there were, quote, scientific methods used to categorize and rate or rank different groups of people. They would measure people's skull. They would look at the color of the skin. They would look at what your hairline was. Mine's receding. That's not so good. So this was all supposedly that you could, and there were, books that were done that would take a picture of someone and they would say, look at this, whatever, how their eyebrows were, dark or whatever. Out of that science of race became eugenics, which basically said, okay, we can categorize people, and gee, some of them are really not up to par. And they were making the assumption that certain social behaviors and mental characteristics were genetic and differed by race. So, for example, in this little chart from 1922, I won't tell you all about the background of it, but it supposedly ranks different groups by social inadequacy. So that included physical characteristics like epilepsy, tuberculosis, deafness. It included mental or cognitive challenge, feeble-mindedness, I call it today developmentally disabled, insanity. It also included dependency, which meant that you received a social, economic, like back in the day, it wasn't Social Security, it wasn't, AFDC, but you received public support. So all of those things were grouped under social inadequacy. And if you look at this chart, we won't go into it, but the people who were seen as having the least social inadequacy, not surprisingly, were people from Western Europe, German, British, or from the Scandinavian area, or native white of native white parents. had the least social, had the most, excuse me, social inadequacy were people from Russia, Poland, and the later immigrants from Ireland, Serbia, and so on. So there was a real sense that if you were from certain areas of the world, you were not of a group that was equivalent to the people who had populated the United States in earlier generations. I mentioned this idea of back to our roots, or back to the colonial revival. It was really, this idea that we need to honor our Anglo-Saxon heritage and the wholesome life of our colonial past, while we were experiencing this rapid urbanization, industrialization, and immigration. So one of the things that is really interesting to look at, and this is still true today, but especially then, were cartoons that were published in various magazines and newsletters, and newspapers. So one idea was that immigrants were stealing the bread off of the table of our hardworking American workers. So this is what this little cartoon is trying to express. The idea that maybe people are being assimilated, but they're really not becoming American. They're really changing our way of life. There was a social and political and cultural danger, a menace. I mean, you can see the people who were in the right coming onto the shores, and Uncle Sam is protecting him, because the concern was that people from Southern Europe, Eastern Europe, were outweighing any people who were coming from the sort of traditional parts of Europe that had populated the US earlier on, and that we needed to protect ourselves from riffraff immigration. We also believed that people who were of the non-dominant religious affiliation of the time was Protestant, was the dominant religious affiliation, but many of the new immigrants were Catholic. Now, if you look at the crocodiles that are coming up on the shores and threatening the United States and its culture, if you look at them carefully, they are bishops with a bishop's mitre. So this was really a reflection of anti-Catholic. And if one of the groups, I mentioned the KKK, one of the groups that the KKK was trying to eradicate, besides Jews and immigrants in general, was Catholics and African Americans, of course, as well. Again, this idea that these people that are coming here are coming from countries that are embracing socialism or communism and anarchy, and that's what we have to be afraid of when we see new waves of immigrants coming to our country. Here's the political response: was the Quota Acts of 1921 and 1924. And you can see this funnel is trying to sort of illustrate that before we had accepted all of these large numbers, there was no immigration laws. There was basically, you could come in as long as you were healthy and you didn't have anything against you. Usually you were needed to say you had somebody who was going to, welcome you, support you, help you get adjusted. But there were no quotas. There was no thing like that. But in the 21 and 1921, 1924, that immigration fell to a tiny percent of the people who had been coming previously from these countries. So I want to talk a little bit about a case study that illustrates this in Trenton. So I'm sure many of you have heard of the Roebling factories. If you haven't, if you're not native to Trenton, as I wasn't native to Trenton, but I do have learned a little bit about the Roebling factories and their important impact on life in Trenton during that era. So here's some postcards, really interesting to look at what Trenton looked like. And many of you I know have seen these large brick buildings, many of them standing empty, but some of them now thankfully being redeveloped. But that's just the ones that remain are just a fraction of the many, many factories, not just the Roebling Wire Works, but potteries, tire manufacturing, tobacco, cigars. I mean, everything. There was everything here. That slogan, Trenton makes, the world takes, was really applicable at that time. Just for your information, I always find it's fun to see what things actually looked like back then. These are shots from inside. One of them, as you can see on the left, is inside one of those buildings, one of those big brick buildings. On the right, you can see for Roebling, they were manufacturing wire cable largely for suspension bridges and other purposes. And you can see the magnitude and of the size of what they were creating there. It was very hard work. It was, I have read some of the reports that were written on employment records that said people were leaving or quitting because it was too hard, it was too noisy, etc. So we have, by chance, it turns out, in the Trentoniana collection of the Trenton Free Public Library, which I hope you are aware that there is such a thing. It collects all kinds of artifacts, documents and flags and clothing and signs that from our history as a city. But one of the things that was there that I discovered, well, was pointed out to me, were 4 shoeboxes essentially full of cards that were the employee cards for about 900 or so Roebling workers between about 1919 and 1923. So just the years right after the First World War, before the immigration quota. And they were assigned a nationality. I'll show you the cards in just a minute. What's really interesting to me is how much information, personal information that we might not think of pertinent to employment, to an employer today, but that were on the card back then. But as you look at the cards, and we'll look at 3 examples, some employees were assigned a European American nationality and some were not. So, for example, we see some, and because everybody's nationality was written down on these cards, some were, for as Irish American or German American or Polish American, but some people, many people sometimes from the same countries, were not given that hyphenated designation. And we can tell that it was the Roebling staff, not the employee, who completed that record. So what we're capturing there is how people in positions of some responsibility in the Roebling factories, people who were responsible for bringing employees on and getting them signed up and so on. Someone who was had to have had a pretty education, good education, literate, and so on and so forth, and responsibility for getting these people signed up. It was those people that were deciding whether someone was employee was American or not. And that gives us a clue into the perceptions of people in Trenton who were working in factories like the Roeblings. Okay, so here's the first card I'm going to show you. So this is Mr. Joseph Hillmeyer. You can see it gives his address. It's got a picture of him, which is really neat. His employee number, and the 50 represents the department within the Roebling factory that he worked in. So it gives this thing that, you normally would expect. You've got his address, you've got his age, he's got information, he's got a wife. Then we go and we see that he's got a nationality, and he's listed as American. He is nationality would have been recorded if he had been born someplace else, but he was born in America, apparently. And he had been a potter. As I mentioned earlier, the pottery was a big industry as well, but maybe the Roebling factory paid better. Maybe he was laid off from the pottery. Who knows? Then we find out about his English fluency as a speaker and his literacy as a reader. And yes, he could speak English and he could read English. Didn't have any other languages. Where he worked before, those are the kind of typical things. Why did he here's the why he quit his work before was that it wasn't steady. He was getting sort of laid off back and forth over time. Next of kin, etc. So that's someone who is unequivocally determined to be American. Here is Mr. Peter, and I don't know if Sandesh, maybe. He is, again, he's got an employee number. 50 is kind of hard to read there, but he's also Department 50. He was 33. He was married. He had a wife and 5 children. Now, here's his nationality listed: Austrian, Polish, American. Now, one thing to note, of course, is that the eastern part of Europe at that point in time was undergoing tremendous upheaval politically. So you had country boundaries constantly being moved around for political and military reasons. So being Austrian and Polish may not have meant that he had, his father was Austrian, his mother was Polish. May just have meant that he had lived within either Austria or Poland, depending on when the different boundaries of those countries had been established. We see that he was naturalized. So he came here as an immigrant, but became naturalized. He could speak English. He could read a little English, but he could speak and read other languages, in this particular case, Polish. Again, it talks about what he did before and so on and so forth. Again, you'll notice laid off, reducing force. We think now, sometimes we think of someone working in a large industrial plant. Let's take the auto workers. They're unionized. Once you get a good job in a factory situation like that, you're going to be sort of set. If you just do your work well, you're going to keep your seniority, you're going to keep on. But what we see in this period, of course, this was before unionization was really taking hold, and employers like the Roebling factory resisted unionization, of course. A lot of people being laid off, brought back, laid off, brought back. So anyway, we see him. He has come here from another country. He was naturalized, and he is somewhat fluent and in English. Now, here is George. Now, again, I'm going to have a hard time. Someone might be able to help me, but I can't do it. So I'm gonna leave it to just Mr. George. So Mr. George is, again, he's got an employee number. He's working in the Department 50. He's younger than our previous person. He's 26 and he's still single. His nationality is Slavish. Now, there wasn't a country called Slav in Europe at that time. If you were Slavish, you could have been from the countries that what is now or was Yugoslavia, Czechoslovakia, what currently could have been from Croatia, Serbia, Slovenia, all of those areas. The people who lived there were described as Slavish. He was naturalized. So he had come, apparently, he must have been a fairly young man, and gotten himself naturalized citizenship. He could speak English, couldn't read it, but he could speak and read in his own language. I'm not sure what that exactly was because I'm not sure about exactly what Slavish was. Um, so there he is. So you'll notice that even though let's go back to the previous guy. So he maybe one of the things that's different, of course, is that he's a little bit older and he's married and has kids. But what I think is pertinent is he came from Austria, Poland. He was naturalized. He could speak. He couldn't read very much, but he was designated as American, at least sharing American identity. Whereas Mr. George here, again, although, maybe the family had something to do with it, if he was not designated as being American. So if you look at all the workers that we have records for, now this is not all the Roebling workers ever, but of these 900 or so folks, about a quarter of them were American only, meaning they came from American stock. About a third were European plus, like that Austrian, Polish, American person. About half, a little less than half, had European only nationalities. In other words, Slavish, as George was. And a smaller number had two or more European nationalities. Now that actually was where the first person would have been, in that two or more, because he had European and so on, Austrian and Polish, I think. Now, we looked more deeply into that because as we were looking at these records, we had to scan them in first and then we had to code them up. We began to notice certain patterns. And one of the patterns was that people from certain areas of Europe were less likely to be considered American than people from other areas of Europe. So this chart here says if you were listed as from a Eastern European country, that could be Poland, the Slavish countries, even Austria, Russia, Hungary, you were not very likely to be considered American compared to if you came from a different country, from Germany potentially, or from France or Scandinavia or whatever. You were going to be more likely to be considered American. So your card would be like our guy from Austria, Poland, /American. Okay, so we looked at why was that the case? Was it because Eastern European immigrants weren't naturalized as much? They were less likely to be naturalized. They were less likely to read English proficiently. They didn't have any proficiency in their native language, reading proficiency, which meant they probably were illiterate. Maybe they didn't have a skill or a trade, but actually none of those particular characteristics mattered. So what did matter? What did matter was the country you came from. And so here's all of the people that we counted, looked at, and thinking that they were sort of in the Eastern European world. Austria, Germany, Hungary, Poland, Romania, Russia, Slavic generally, and Slovakia. Slavic and Slovak tended to be sort of a group that didn't have a particular country, but had a sort of a quote, a nationality. So you can see that certain countries in Eastern Europe were more likely to be considered if you came from there, you were more likely to be considered American, even if you were Austrian. So our Austrian Polish guy had both Austrian and Polish there, and both of those were, if you were Austrian, to be considered American if you were here, regardless if you were naturalized, could speak English, whatever, Russian even, but Hungarian, Romanian, Slavic, Slovak, certain groups were definitely very unlikely, regardless of their education, their language capacity, their naturalization status, to be considered American. So what this tells us is that we have certain concepts about certain people from certain countries. It's sort of like the concepts that people used to have about race. You know, if you were from a certain area, Mediterranean, you were lower on the totem pole than if you were from England or Scandinavia or so on. That carried over into things that, like how they were considered by the roadling worker who was filling out their card. So how does this history relate to immigration in the US today? And I think that's where I hope that maybe you have some ideas and questions and comments. But I wanted to tell you about a little bit to give some context about Trenton's population today. So we have about 91,000 people. A big chunk of them are either Hispanic or African American. And the Hispanic and African American populations are almost equal. If we look at our younger people who are in our public schools, we see Hispanic, Latino is 61% of the student enrollment, African American 37, and then everybody else a tiny bit. So questions, are things different today in the world or in the United States in terms of the push and pull factors that get people here? Things like political instability, economic challenges, and so on. Are we having the same kind of response to immigrants today? And where does this leave us as a nation? I'm going to stop right there. Are there any questions in these chat?
I just had a question about the Know Nothing Party. I don't know if
Yes.
you want to elaborate a little bit more.
Well, as I say, I'm not as familiar with that. Why they call themselves the Know Nothing, I have no idea. But yes, they were definitely against immigration. And that was true, even of the mainstream political parties. Obviously, by the time you get to the 1920s and even the 1880s, the different acts that passed Congress were very clearly supported by the majority of Congress people, presumably reflecting their constituencies' opinions. Where did all the whites go in Trenton? So that Trenton is tightly bound by other municipalities around us. And, basically what you see, and this is very vividly illustrated in Chambersburg. I don't know how many of you have lived in Trenton long enough. Yes, there you go. To have seen Chambersburg turn over. Now, I do have to tell you that apparently the restaurants and the population in Chambersburg early on was German. They left and Italians moved in. We had wonderful Italian restaurants. Beginning of this, maybe 10, 15 years ago, we would see headlines in the Trentoniana or Trenton Times. Another restaurant leaves Chambersburg. There's no good restaurants left. Our wonderful restaurant district is becoming desolate. Well, if any of you have gone to the restaurant district in Chambersburg now, you see there are Costa Rican restaurants. There's Guatemalan, there's Puerto Rican, I'm not sure there's Puerto Rican, but there's, all of the other immigrant groups that have come recently have established in the same buildings restaurants with wonderful food from their countries. Um, and if you go to Hamilton and so on, you will see some of the names of the restaurants that had been located in Chambersburg have moved elsewhere. One of the things that also happens, for example, there was a large Jewish community across the street from where the Trent House is now. What happened there was that they were very education oriented and so on, strove very hard. They sent their kids to college. And this is true for the Italian, second and third generation. They go to college. They work. Everybody, their parents work hard. Their grandparents work hard. They send them to college. They become, a teacher, a lawyer, or whatever. And they say, "Mom, Pop, I've seen how hard it is to work in the factory, in the restaurant. There's nothing for me here. I'm going to go live and work someplace else." So that's the kind of dynamic that happened. Now, and I'm going to throw this in, and I don't know how much people want to think about this, but a federal policy back in the New Deal, back in the Depression, labeled certain neighborhoods in cities as undesirable for investment, called redlining. And you probably have heard of that. A big swath of Trenton was labeled as that redlined area where we lost, and that's where we lost investment. And then with urban renewal, we lost neighborhoods. So there were a lot of factors that were churning here to affect our population. Look at some of those political cartoons, and I look at political rhetoric, and I wonder how much we've learned from our history. Those populations that we were so adamant would never fit in and that were going to ruin our country, the people from Czechoslovakia, the people from Croatia, the people from Hungary, and so on like that. They have contributed to the growth of our country. And they're now the Americans, right? So I don't know what you think about whether we have the opportunity as a nation to do something different with immigration, whether immigration is different now, that we think that there's a real reason why we would have maybe some of the same fears and concerns that people back in the 1920s had. What do people think? Back in the 1920s, people had a lot of fears about the immigrants that were coming from Eastern Europe, let's say, or from Italy even, about whether they were going to contribute, whether they were taking people's jobs, whether they were going to have political ideas that were contradictory to democracy, whether they were going to be criminals. And yet those same groups of people have now become part of mainstream America. Some of those same concerns are raised today about new immigrants that are coming. And my question, I guess, is, do you feel that's warranted? Do you feel that the times are different, or our society is different, that we should have more concerns? Or would we, if we could look ahead 50 years, would we see our new immigrants fully integrated into our society, just as we did those immigrants from the 1920s?
I think we're going to see them integrate just as we did before. People move on to different jobs, different aspects of life. And so I feel like it's going to be the same kind of way that it was previously. Like we're always going to change, we're always going to grow, and always more people are going to be coming to America to live the American dream.
How do others feel? Because that is certainly one trajectory our country could go on. Do we think our society or our country or economy is different enough now that maybe it will be more difficult for newcomers to make it here, to, get their children educated, to get decent jobs, be living in, move to the suburbs, whatever they're going to do, live the American dream? Do we think it's going to be more difficult today? I don't know. But certainly there's some of the same anxiety is being expressed about new immigrants. And I guess I would hope that we would look back on our past and say, oh, back then, my grandparents would have had these same concerns, or the grandparents of, people like me who have a German and English background would have had the same kind of concerns. And say, but we can, like Miss Snow did, that we can expect that these people who are coming, who are new, that we're worried about, that we're anxious about, are going to end up, being our fellow Americans at some point. I would love to have people come to the Trent House at some point. And when it comes to taxes, yes, anxiety when it comes to taxes. Consuela, is that because there is a concern that people who are here, particularly without working papers, are not contributing to our taxes and therefore not, but using services?
Absolutely.
Mhm.
I've had to pay taxes. I've been audited before. And I guess for me, sometimes my concern is what I'm paying against what someone else never has to pay. That's
Yeah.
my issue, not someone coming here. You're not taking anything from me, but I am a person that's like, what are you giving back? When I look
Yeah.
at what I pay for medical insurance, what I pay for taxes, what I've had to
Mhm.
pay in taxes, that some people have a job and probably could be making just as much as me and paying no taxes. That's my concern, how that affects me and my income and my
Right.
taxes.
Well, and you're well taken, because the environment, the economic and taxation environment today is very different. Back in the 1920s, there was no Social Security, so there was no taxes there. There was no, you didn't have to have working papers. If you were working, you were like everybody else. You paid whatever taxes everybody else paid. So you didn't have to be, quote, legal in order to get legal, to be registered in the tax system. Now, of course, an employer, if they are hiring you, either has to prove that you have green papers or whatever they're called, and put you on the payroll and do the payroll taxes and all that other kind of stuff, or they're hiring you under the table. In which case, because maybe they don't think that you have papers or you don't have papers. And that person is not collecting taxes. That employer is not collecting taxes to pay, into the tax system. So there's two big differences. There weren't certain kind of taxes back then, and everybody was treated as an employee. They didn't differentiate. You didn't have to have papers. Now we have a very different system. So it's possible for somebody who does not have working papers to work, quote unquote, under the table and make money and not pay into the tax system. one of the challenges about that we as a society face then is that that person not only is not paying taxes, but getting police protection, getting, water, whatever. But they're also not getting other benefits that might, and I'm thinking here in particularly healthcare benefits, that might make a difference in collectively our costs of our society. So if we have people and this is, this because you're the health team, people in our community and our society who don't have health insurance, their illnesses, which they get because they're not immune from it any more than any of the rest of us, are costing us money because there's no, they are being given health care when they're more ill. They're going to go to the hospital and get, charity care and so on. That's costing us also. So it's a challenge where we are. So it's not just a challenge of an individual not having papers, but how do we take care of the fact that without papers, people can't take care of themselves in the same way that someone who's quote unquote legal can? Very hard questions, very, very difficult. And I just think that if we look back at our history and we understand what's the similar now, what's different now, and we say, how are we going to create our society so that we can overcome some of the challenges that we're seeing today? And hope, as Ms. Snow said, that people who are here, who are contributing to our society, can be fully integrated. And people who, who does that mean? Does it mean somebody who's went through the immigration process and were naturalized, or does it mean somebody who is here without papers? Where do we draw the line?
I just wanted to say thank you for your presentation.
Okay, well, thank you all. It was great to have a chance to talk to you, tell you a little bit about the Trent House.